Hello knitters, thank you for joining this video on how to work the Japanese short rows. As a designer, short rows are such an awesome concept because it allows a lot of flexibility in terms of making shapes or working two colors where you don't have to use intarsia or any other method. You can work one color at a time. They're extremely flexible, really fun to work. And among my favorite short row techniques, it's the one that I'm going to show you today, which is the Japanese short rows. To begin with, you need some tools for Japanese short rows. You need either safety pins or locking stitch markers. And you'll see how I'm going to use these. You use them when you make your turn to make sure that you identify that wrap that you need to work. Now, if you are using, say, lace weight yarn, I would probably go with something thin like this as safety pins. If you're working with worsted weight yarn, probably I would go with something more like the safety pins, or rather the locking stitch markers. For this demo, I am actually going to show you, to set some context, I'm going to start working the short rows from the center out to make this shape. And by that I mean I'm going to start here in the center of the shape, and I'm going to increase stitches. Every time I make a pass, I'm going to increase by one stitch to the left and one stitch to the right. So let me begin. I do have this little sample I'm going to show you. I'm using worsted weight yarn because it makes it easier for the demo. So I marked my center stitch, and I'm going to start here. My first row is going to get to that center stitch. I'm going to make an increase into it, and then I'm going to knit one stitch past it, make my turn. My second row is going to be on the wrong side. I'm going to start with that where I made that turn and work past the center stitch and the increase I made there and add one stitch on the left, rather on the right here, but it'll be on my left when I turn my work. So, but to get to that center stitch in here, I have to knit to it. Okay, I'm here at the center stitch. I am going to make an increase into the center stitch. I'm going to knit one stitch past it, and I'm going to make my turn. So I turn here. At this point, I take one of my stitch markers. I put it around the yarn itself. Then for Japanese short rows, almost always I slip that first stitch and I work to my next turn point. In this case, I already worked here the increase I made in the center stitch. I'm going to work one more stitch and I'm going to make my turn. As a reminder, I'm forming this shape. Your pattern or your design may be differently, where you may be actually starting with longer rows and then decreasing the number of rows as you work your short rows. You start with long, many stitches and decreasing the number of stitches as you increase the number of short rows. So here I added my stitch marker. I slip my first stitch and I knit to my next turn, and I am going to increase in my center stitch, my new center stitch now, because that's my pattern, and I knit to the turn. So here, if you can see, I've knit in essence 3 short rows, starting with that center stitch and one stitch. Again, remember I made an increase into it. And then my next row was on the wrong side. I worked past that center stitch and I added one stitch. And then now I want to add one stitch on my third row, but I have a huge gap I need to reconcile somehow. And that's easy. For the Japanese short rows, I will pull on this loop that I have on the stitch marker, which, by the way, it has a top leg and a bottom leg relative to the stitch marker. I'm going to put it on the left needle tip in such a way where the top leg is in the front toward me, and will rotate the stitch marker to the back, and I will knit this next stitch together with that loop. That's how I bridge the gap on the right side of the work. Let me show you. So here, this was where my row ended, and I added a stitch and I closed that huge gap that was already there. At this point, I will take out the stitch marker that's hanging in the back, turn my work, put that stitch marker back on the yarn, and proceed working my next row. I will slip that first stitch and I will purl here to my next turn. You'll notice that my next turn is right here. My stitch marker is actually between the two last stitches of this row. So I'm going to knit that stitch. That's still part of my previous row. And now I want to knit one more stitch, but there's a huge gap again, and I need to close it on the wrong side of the work. The easiest way to do this, as far as I'm concerned, is to transfer the stitch from the left to the right needle tip, the next stitch, put that loop from the stitch marker with the top leg toward me first on the left needle, and again, because I want to have this top leg to the front, I have to go under and put that stitch on the needle, rotate the stitch marker to the back, transfer that stitch that I moved from the left to the right back again to the left needle, and simply purl these two stitches together like that. Now I can take my stitch marker off. Then I turn my work, put the stitch marker back around the needle, and proceed working my next row. I'm going to show you one more time. I will slip that first stitch, tighten my yarn so there is no slack, knit to the turn, almost there. And on the right side, I simply put that loop, top leg toward me to the front on the left needle tip, and knit these two stitches, the loop and the stitch together. You may ask, why don't I remove the stitch marker when I put the loop on the left needle? The reason being is that that loop may slip, and if you don't have the stitch marker on it, you may not be able to recover it. So it's a very good practice to keep that marker on until that loop is worked. Then you can just remove that stitch marker and it will be available to work the next row. And I'm going to show you one more time how to make that connection on the wrong side of the work. I slip that stitch, that first stitch, I tighten and remove all the slack, knit to the turn. In this case, by the way, I am purling, knit, I am using that generically. I am purling to the turn. And I showed you the first time how I transferred this stitch from the left to the right needle tip, and I put this loop onto the right needle tip and transferred that back and purled two together. In my opinion, that's the easier way to do this, to work this. However, there is another way to do it, and which is to actually go ahead and put that loop onto the needle, the left needle tip first, rotate the excuse me, the locking stitch marker to the back. Then what you want to do is slip knitwise that loop, slip knitwise that stitch, and then you're going to transfer those back to the left needle. So I'm slipping knitwise, slipping knitwise. I'm going to transfer those back to the right needle, and I'm going to kind of keep my finger in there like this under, because then I'm going to reach behind both of these and purl them together through the back loop. This action actually will result in exactly the same way as when I switch the order of the stitches and purl them together, what I showed you in the beginning. So I'm going to take out my locking stitch marker, turn my work, and proceed with working my next row similar to what I showed you before. Just wanna knit a couple stitches, and I want to show you the shape that we formed here. So here we are. This is our center stitch, our center spine of this form in here. And we started in the center, and we have been increasing stitches as we progress in our short rows. And you'll notice, because we're also adding in the center, that form is shaping nicely. And we are making connections really right here at the bottom. So every time we knit all the way to that bottom row here, or that row that we started with on both sides, and we connect the short rows together. One final comment, you will have noticed that I do have stitch markers in here. And that is, I already calculated, the number of stitches I need to form this shape. And I put stitch markers visually to indicate when I am finished working my short row to create this shape. But that's really has nothing to do with the technique itself. It has to do with the pattern. So you will have a pattern that you're working with, but in terms of applying the Japanese short row technique, it's exactly the same as I've showed you in here, on the right side and on the wrong side. This is it. I hope that you will find this video helpful. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.